for the corporate branch would be
Dreaming of IT but not interested in coding? Well,
हम्म ये दिमाग खराब कर रही है मेरा चैट बॉक्स नहीं काम करके। फक हो रहा है भाई, फक।
you're not alone.
आ गया भाई, इतना लेटेंसी कितनी खराब चल रही है समझ नहीं सकते। लास्ट चेक। हम्म यस, सो लेट्स स्टार्ट अगेन उसी पॉइंट से।
But you know what?
से 2
You
मिनट
don't
पीछे
really
था,
the employee with
Yeah.
the ID of
यहाँ से मिस किया।
of a foreign key. So the foreign key
नहीं, यहाँ
referring to her branch ID is 1, which means she is in the corporate branch, right? Because branch ID number 1 is corporate. Michael Scott, his branch ID is 2, which means he's in the Scranton branch, right? So this number is mapping this row over here into this other table. And that's what a foreign key does. A foreign key is essentially just a way that we can define relationships between the two tables. So a foreign key is just a primary key of another table. So Andy Bernard, right, his branch ID is 3, which means he belongs to the Stanford branch. And so that's what a foreign key does. A foreign key allows us to link up or define relationships between tables, right? I could say that Andy belongs to the Stanford. That means is that Michael Scott is the manager of the Scranton branch, right? We were able to define that relationship by using these foreign keys. So down here, the Stanford branch, the manager is 102. If we come up here, we can see employee 102 is Josh Porter. So Josh Porter is the manager of the Stanford branch. Corporate over here, the manager ID is 108. So over here, we didn't actually include 108 over there. So obviously this isn't like, you know, a huge table of employees, but the manager for the corporate branch would be the employee with the ID of 108, whatever that would be inside of this table. So that's what a foreign key does. A foreign key is able to help us to define relationships between the tables, right? I can define which branch a specific employee belongs to by including the branch's ID as a foreign key in the employee table. Similarly, I can define which employee is the manager of a branch by including that employee's ID as a foreign key in the branch table. So that's really why foreign keys are going to come in handy. And it's also important to note that
तो अभी यहाँ पॉज करते हैं। बेसिकली इसमें ये बंदा ये बता रहा है कि ये जो ब्रांच है ना, ब्रांच जो एम्प्लॉय टेबल में, ये चलते हैं, इसको फॉरेन की क्यों बोला, क्योंकि ये किसी और टेबल में हमारी ये ब्रांच में हमारी ये प्राइमरी की है। तो अब इस टेबल का यूज करके जैसे मैं इसको जैन की मैं ब्रांच कर सकता हूँ, जैन की सॉरी ब्रांच नेम फाइंड कर सकता हूँ। तो जैन की ब्रांच आईडी अगर 1 है तो हम ब्रांच टेबल में जाके डायरेक्टली उसको कॉर्पोरेट बता सकते हैं। सिमिलरली मैं अगर बात करूं मैनेजर आईडी की, तो मैनेजर आईडी ब्रांच टेबल में प्राइमरी की है हमारी, लेकिन सेम वो एम्प्लॉय टेबल में जो मैनेजर आईडी है एज ए एम्प्लॉय आईडी, एज ए एम्प्लॉय आईडी एट्रीब्यूट, वो एक नॉर्मल एट्रीब्यूट है, वो एक नॉर्मल एट्रीब्यूट है। तो उस केस में हम इसका इस्तेमाल करके हम जैसे किसी ब्रांच को लिया स्क्रैंटन को, और उसकी मैनेजर आईडी ली 101, तो उस एम्प्लॉय के बारे में कि इस ब्रांच में इस मैनेजर आईडी का कौन सा एम्प्लॉय है, मतलब इस ब्रांच में कौन सा एम्प्लॉय है, तो डायरेक्टली स्क्रैंटन से मैं पता लगा सकता हूँ कि माइकल यहाँ काम करता है, यहाँ कौन काम करता है, माइकल। सिंपल है। तो फॉरेन की का मतलब ये है कि किसी टेबल में कोई ऐसी की नॉर्मल एट्रीब्यूट जो किसी और टेबल में प्राइमरी की है। और ये इन दोनों का रिलेशनशिप और इन दोनों एट्रीब्यूट्स को दो टेबल्स के बीच में रिलेशनशिप डिफाइन करने के लिए यूज किया जाए। इतना ही सिंपल मतलब है।
in the branch table. So that's really why foreign keys are going to come in handy. And it's also important to note that a particular table can have more than one foreign branch on it. So over here I have my employee table, right? And it's the same exact thing as we had before, but I also added another attribute or another column over here, which is super ID. And that stands for supervisor ID. And so what this is going to do is it's going to define who is the supervisor of a particular employee. And what's cool about this foreign key is it's actually relating back to the same table. So an employee can be a supervisor of another employee. So over here we have Angela Martin, right? Her employee ID is 103 and her supervisor ID is 101. That means her supervisor is the employee with the ID 101. So if we come over here, we can look, Angela Martin's supervisor is Michael Scott because Michael Scott has an employee ID of 101. So Michael Scott's super ID is 100. That means Michael Scott's supervisor is the employee with ID 100, which is Jan Levinson. So we can use this foreign key over here on the employee table to define relationships between employees. So before we defined the relationship between the employee table and the branch table, and now we're defining a relationship between the employee table and the employee table, right? And so what's cool about this is then basically inside of this table, right, we can tell what the different supervisor-supervisee relationships are, right? I can tell that Josh Porter's supervisor is Jan Levinson, and I can tell that Angela Martin's supervisor is Michael Scott. I'm defining that information by using a foreign key. All right, so let's take a look at another table. Actually,
तो बोला यहाँ पे है कि किसी टेबल में दो फॉरेन कीज हो सकती हैं सेम फाइंड करने के लिए। ये क्या आवाज आई? अपना तो मस्त चल रहा है, कुछ आवाज आई थी, इग्नोर करते हैं अभी। हाँ, तो बात ये कर रहा है यहाँ पे कि जैसे हमने पकड़ा एम्प्लॉय आईडी 101 को, माइकल को, तो इसकी एक फॉरेन की जो है वो तो ब्रांच आईडी है 2, दूसरी फॉरेन की है सुपर आईडी 100। और सुपर आईडी से पता चलता है कि जो जैन लेविंसन है वो इसकी सुपरवाइजर है। समझ रहे हो? तो दो फॉरेन की का इस्तेमाल सेम टेबल में रिलेशन पता लगाने के लिए हो सकता है।
added in another table down here. So over here we have employee, just like we had before, we have branch, and then we also have branch supplier. And branch supplier is another table that we can look at. So a branch supplier would basically define who the suppliers are for specific branches, right? So we have these branches, maybe they're selling, a certain product, maybe they're selling like paper products, and the branch suppliers would define who are the suppliers for that branch. And you'll notice up here, the primary key actually consists of two columns. And this is what we would call a composite key or a composite key. And a composite key is basically a key that needs two attributes. So this key is made up of two columns, right? It's made up of branch ID and supplier name. So branch ID is actually going to refer to the specific branch, and supplier name is going to refer to the specific supplier, right? So we could say over here that Hammermill supplies paper to branch number 2, right? So Hammermill supplies paper to Scranton. Uniball supplies writing utensils to branch ID number 2, which is Scranton. Patriot Paper supplies paper to branch ID number 3, which is Stamford. So inside of this branch supplier table, I'm able to define which different suppliers are supplying what to which different branches. Now, the reason that I need this composite key or this composite key is because the supplier name doesn't uniquely identify each row and the branch ID doesn't uniquely identify each row. Only together can they uniquely identify each row, right? So for example, supplier name Hammermill. You'll notice that Hammermill shows up here and it also shows up here, right? So Hammermill supplies to branch number 2 and they also supply to branch number 3. A Uniball supplies to branch number 3 and Uniball supplies to branch number 2. So this column has repeated values, right? This column has Hammermill repeated. It has Uniball repeated. Branch ID also has those things repeated, right? So branch ID 2 shows up here a bunch of times. Branch ID 3 shows up here a bunch of times, right? And so the branch ID column can't uniquely identify the table, and the supplier name column can't uniquely identify the table. Only together can they uniquely identify it, right? So we would say Hammermill supplies branch 2. That combination only shows up once, right? We wouldn't put that combination again because we're already defining it. So Hammermill supplies branch 2, Hammermill supplies branch 3. These two rows are uniquely identified by the supplier name and the branch ID. And so over here in these employee and the branch table, we only defined one column as the primary key, but over here we define two columns as the primary key, which would be a composite key. And that's actually pretty common where we're gonna have two columns uniquely identifying each row. All right, so down here I wanna show you guys one more.
तो इससे पहले कि आगे बढ़े, तो यहाँ पे ये बंदा कह रहा है ना कि जो हमारी कॉम्पोजिट की है, थोड़ा मैं ये हटाता हूँ। कॉम्पोजिट की का मतलब होता है आप दो एट्रीब्यूट्स मिला के एक प्राइमरी की बना रहे हो। मतलब उन दोनों एट्रीब्यूट्स में एज अ सिंगल एट्रीब्यूट कोई मीनिंग नहीं मिलेगा टेबल को, है ना? कि आप हैमर मिल से या यूनिवॉल से आइडेंटिफाई नहीं कर सकते कि कौन सी सप्लाई टाइप है। लेकिन अगर आप ये ऐसे कहो कि हैमर मिल ब्रांच आईडी 2 में पेपर सप्लाई करता है, तो इसका सेंस बनेगा। लेकिन आप ये नहीं कह सकते कि ब्रांच आईडी 2 में पेपर सप्लाई होता है सिर्फ, ब्रांच आईडी 2 में सिर्फ राइटिंग यूटेंसिल सप्लाई होती है। आप ऐसा नहीं कह सकते। यू कैन नॉट से लाइक दैट। आप ये कह सकते हो कि ब्रांच आईडी 2 में यूनिबॉल की सिर्फ राइटिंग यूटेंसिल सप्लाई होती है। जेटी फॉर्म्स एंड लेबल्स कस्टम्स फॉर्म सप्लाई करती है ब्रांच आईडी 2 में। हैमर मिल थर्ड ब्रांच आईडी में पेपर सप्लाई करती है। आप समझ रहे हो? You can like you need when you need more than one attributes to identify other attributes. That's where composite key comes.
Pretty common where we're going to have two columns uniquely identifying each row. All right, so down here I want to show you guys one more example, and this is going to show you one other way that we can define like different relationships with these tables. So I actually added in two other tables. We have a client table and we have this works with table. So let me kind of walk you guys through this a little bit. We still have employee, we still have branch, but over here we're defining clients. And so a client might be like a customer, right? So a client would buy paper products or whatever products from the branch and employee, right? So the client has a client ID, they have a client name, and then they also have a foreign key, which is a branch ID. So a client is going to be associated with a specific branch, right? So we would say Lackawanna County is associated with branch 2, which means Lackawanna County is going to buy products. To show you the branch table, we only defined which is be a composite key. And that's actually pretty common where we're going to have two columns uniquely identifying each row. All right, so down here I want to show you guys one more example, and this is going to show you one other way that we can define like different relationships with these tables. So I actually added in two other tables. We have a client table and we have this works with table. So let me kind of walk you guys through this a little bit. We still have employee, we still have branch, but over here we're defining clients. And so a client might be like a customer, right? So a client would buy paper products or whatever products from the branch and employee, right? So the client has a client ID, they have a client name, and then they also have a foreign key, which is a branch ID. So a client is going to be associated with a specific branch, right? So we would say Lackawanna County is associated with branch 2, which means Lackawanna County is going to buy products from the Scranton branch. The John Daly Law LLC is going to buy products from branch ID number 3, so they're going to buy products from the Stanford branch, right? So this is a client table. And down here, we have this works with table. And what the works with table is doing is it's defining the relationships between the employees and the clients, namely how much paper an employee sells to a specific client. So over here, we have employee ID, we have client ID, and we have total sales. So the employee ID is going to refer to an employee in the employee table. The client ID is going to refer to a client in the client table. And then we're going to define how much in product the client has bought from the employee. So employee 101, for example, that is Michael Scott. Michael Scott has sold client ID 401. Michael Scott has sold Lackawanna County $267,000 worth of product, right? How about this one, 104? So Andy Bernard has sold client number 403, has sold John Daly Law $5,000 in paper products. And so this works with table is able to define how much an employee has sold to a client. And you'll notice over here we have a composite key. And the composite key is employee ID and client ID. And this is actually a special type of composite key because both of these columns are actually foreign keys. So employee ID is a foreign key, right? It relates to the employee table. Client ID is also a foreign key. It relates to the client table. And both of those foreign keys together makes up the primary key of the table. And that is actually a very useful way to define a primary key, because when we do something like this, we can define a relationship, right? So I can define how much product the client has bought from the employee. And that is something that could be really useful to keep track of. So as you can see, like these tables can, either be very simple or they can be very complex. And the more complex your database design or your database schema is, the more complex these tables and these keys are going to have to be, right? So this employee table has a primary key and two foreign keys. The client table has a primary key and a foreign key. This works with table has a composite key, both of which are foreign keys. Like it can get very complex, but we can use the primary keys and the foreign keys in order to define different relationships. But really that is just I think a pretty good introduction into kind of how tables work. We talked about rows and columns. We talked about primary keys. We talked
तो इसमें बंदे ने बड़ा अच्छा एग्जांपल दिया है कि जो एम्प्लॉय टेबल में एम्प्लॉय आईडी है ना अपनी वो प्राइमरी की है, क्लाइंट टेबल में क्लाइंट आईडी अपनी प्राइमरी की है, और वर्कशीट टेबल में अपनी एम्प्लॉय आईडी और क्लाइंट आईडी फॉरेन की है। पर अगर आप देखा जाए तो ये एम्प्लॉय आईडी और क्लाइंट आईडी जो फॉरेन की मिलके एक कॉम्पोजिट की बना रही है जो टोटल सेल्स आइडेंटिफाई कर रही है कि एम्प्लॉय आईडी 107 का बंदा क्लाइंट 400 को 55,000 की सेल्स कर चुका है। एम्प्लॉय आईडी 101 का बंदा क्लाइंट आईडी 401 को 2,67,000 की सेल कर चुका है। 105 के एम्प्लॉय आईडी का बंदा 402 नंबर के क्लाइंट को 22,500 की सेल कर चुका है। तो मतलब कितना बढ़िया यूज है, आप खुद देखो। मतलब इससे भी कॉम्प्लेक्स और अच्छा हो सकता है, डिपेंड करता है आप कैसे यूज कर सकते हो, कितना आपको आता है वो भी है।
About surrogate keys and natural keys, the different types of keys that might map to the real world or not. We talked about foreign keys, we talked about composite keys, and I kind of showed you guys a few different examples of ways that things might work. So this would be like our company database, and obviously we would have a lot more information in here, but this is kind of a good example of how we might define different tables and then define the relationships between those tables in a relational database.
थोड़ा लेते हैं अभी गाइस, क्योंकि खाना खाने का समय हो गया मेरा। तब तक के लिए बाय बाय। कोई व्यूवर्स तो नहीं है, मैं लगा रहा हूँ बी राइट बैक की स्क्रीन यहाँ पे, और